And good morning, everyone from Mystery Island. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to Macduff Lives, and a special welcome back to Harley Schlanger. Harley, I haven't seen you in 3 weeks, and I miss you already. How are you doing today?
Well, I miss our usual Tuesday get-togethers, so I'm glad to see you.
Yeah, well, I took a vacation, man. Went out to Arizona, and my wife and I, and we spent a few days trying. We actually got to see the Grand Canyon, take the famous Grand Canyon pictures and everything. But we just squeezed in between two big snowstorms, in which a lot
Ah,
of a lot of traffic got in snarled up and accidents and everything. But not us. We zipped in, and then when we saw the snow coming, we zipped out, and we were very fortunate to make the trip. So I'm back and looking forward to getting into the content with you. Had a great conversation with Diane Sayre last night on my show. She's always a pleasure to talk to and
yeah.
very, very lively. Uh, and yeah, when she pulls the bullhorn out, look out, you know.
Well, and she's unleashing a squad of young people in the New York area who are confronting all these phony progressives over their pro-war funding in the Congress, like AOC, like Hakeem Jeffries, who's the top Democrat in the House. Um, 2 days ago, they hit Anna Applebaum, who is the pro-war hawk from the Atlantic Monthly and the Atlantic Council, whose husband is the former Polish foreign minister, Sikorski. And my associate asked her, because she was refusing to answer any questions about the Seymour Hersh article accusing Biden of being behind the sabotage of the North Sea pipelines. So he said, "Why don't you talk about this?" And she wouldn't say anything. And he said, "Well, your husband tweeted out, 'Thank you, US,' when it just happened." And she said, "That was a joke." And he said, "Well, no one's laughing."
Uh,
And then you see the picture of her looking miserable in the corner, having been confronted with the truth. So Diane has a team that's going out and finding opportunities to confront these war hawks. I mean, I don't know, John, one of the things that we've been talking about is what's happening in Syria now after the earthquake, where because the sanctions are technically somewhat lifted, but not really, because companies are afraid to go in because they're afraid they'll get sanctioned. So they're afraid to even deliver packages of food and clothing. And so the children in those areas hit by the earthquakes in Idlib and Aleppo are being forced to suffer more because of US sanctions, supposedly protecting them from the Assad government. So uh, there was a vote in the Congress last week on the lifting of should the sanctions be kept in place. These are the so-called Caesar sanctions from 2019. The vote in the Congress was 414-2 to keep the sanctions in place, which are killing people. And that shows you the demented nature of this current administration. Now, I'm sure Diane may have discussed that last night, or I think she might have.
sure.
Yeah. But there's a bill before the Congress now, and something that your viewers can do something about. Probably tomorrow, Matt Gaetz's resolution, which is called H period con period res period 21, calls for the removal of 900 US troops that are in Syria. They were just visited by the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, 2 days ago to assess their situation there. Now, what are they doing there? Supposedly protecting the Free Syrian Army, which is the Kurdish army, but they're also protecting Al Qaeda and ISIS in the area. So why are they there? And what Gaetz's resolution says, there's been no congressional action to authorize, to declare war or to authorize US troops going there. The Syrian government said this is an infringement on sovereignty of Syria. So people can call your congressman today and tomorrow and ask them to support the Gaetz resolution HCON Res 21. We need to get a mobilization because otherwise the world sees the United States as the biggest damn hypocrites. We talk about protecting sovereignty in Ukraine while we're denying sovereignty to the Syrian people and punishing them for resisting the regime change that the US was backing by sending arms to ISIS and Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra in Syria. So this is something I'm quite agitated about this, and I hope some of your viewers are also, and will take the opportunity to jump on the phone and call your congressman and give them hell over this.
I hope you'll forgive me if I don't pick up the phone and call Steny Hoyer, who is my I think he's one of the worst war hawks of the Democratic Party has right now, and it's a damn shame. But
I think he needs to hear from someone who would, in his district, who would say, "I'm not supporting you on this, you damn hypocrite." It never hurts to speak truth to power, John.
all right, Harley, you've put me on the spot, and after the show, I'm going to call Steny Hoyer's office and speak to somebody in the staff and tell them how I feel about it. I think I have to, and we all have to. So,
And if anyone's interested in getting the details, they can send me an email at my personal email address, and I'll send you the short report we have on the bill and the phone number to call. So you can write to me at harleysch@gmail.com, and I'll send this out right away, because we may have, Scalise, the House Republican manager, said they may put the bill on the floor by tomorrow. So it's got to be quick action.
boy, that Scalise story when he got shot at that congressional softball or baseball game, that story just went away. It's almost like he
Yeah.
didn't get shot, but it was horrible. And these things are real. And
Yeah.
I am encouraged that he's hung in there, and as well as supporting, hopefully, the action to curtail our involvement in Syria by forcing a withdrawal of the troops. Is very much like what's happened in the past, where a president would have exceeded his authority by sending troops somewhere without even talking to Congress. I remember they used to have what was it, the team of 8 or the team of 4 or something you had to consult with, but
Yeah.
no longer are the presidents even consulting with them. And it goes to the broader question, which really goes to the whole Russia thing, is the reason that we're giving Syria such a hard time is because they are a potential or actual ally of Russia, and we just can't have that. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think it goes back a little bit more than that. The problem you have if you're the unipolar world order is you don't want any resistance from poorer or smaller countries like Libya, Iraq, Syria. And so anyone who stands for developing their country against the idea of the unipolar order becomes a target. And Syria was a relatively prosperous place. There were some arguments on the question of how fully democratic the country was, but it was certainly more democratic than Saudi Arabia or Kuwait. And Assad was building hospitals. You had women in positions of authority in Syria. Syria was multi-religious, multi-ethnic country. And what they did is they used the Sunni-Shia dispute to launch a regime change operation against Assad. And Obama started it. Obama, Samantha Power, Hillary Clinton saw this as an opportunity to take down another opponent in the Middle East. And the reason Syria survived, it's twofold. One is because most of the population maintained their support for Assad. They saw him as fighting for the country against the Islamic fundamentalist terrorists. And then secondly, as you pointed out, Putin came in first when there were the charges that Syria was gassing its own citizens. Putin came in and said to Assad, let's shut down your chemical weapons program. Let's shut it down completely, and show them that that's not true. Now, turns out that there are exposés coming from the United Kingdom that the group claiming Assad was using chemical weapons is the White Helmets, which is funded largely by the British government, by jihadist groups, and by the BBC. So it's another false flag. that was used to target a political leader who opposed the unipolar order. So Assad survived. Now, the Russians played a huge role in this, but I think you have to give credit to the Syrian people because they stood up and fought in a terrible situation where the U.S., according to the former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Mike Flynn, the U.S. was arming the Islamic terrorists with weapons that were passed through Benghazi, Libya, after they overthrew Gaddafi. They went through Turkey into Syria. So the U.S. was providing logistical backup. And John, I'm sure you remember this, the photo of John McCain cluelessly standing next to leaders of the terrorist groups with a big smile on his face saying, "We're defending freedom in Syria." So, the Assad government survived. The Russians played a role in it. And now the people of Syria, the most vulnerable people, children, who have seen their parents killed in the earthquake and have no place to go, no place to turn, can't get blankets, can't get clothes because of US sanctions. I have a contact from Vancouver, Canada, who set up a GoFundMe fundraising to raise money to provide blankets, clothes, and powdered milk. And GoFundMe shut it down because they said the Treasury Department says this violates sanctions. So that's what your US government is doing to perpetuate misery in a country that was torn by civil war that we supported and then was hit with this tragic earthquake.
It should make everybody angry. And hopefully people are going to start realizing that the government that we have here, that our U.S. government, as you put it, is not really our government. It's and this has been my big point about the Kennedy assassination, is that it was a coup, and the people that ran the coup are the ones that have been running the government ever since. And the idea that we are in a democracy here is laughable. But yet our battle cry is we're spreading democracy throughout the world. But the only way that
we're going from coup to coup under leaders that are cuckoo.
we lost the last part of your comment. Would you say that again, please?
I said we're going from coup to coup under the direction of leaders who are cuckoo.
All right. Now, I'm going to have to go and get my dog now to bring in Coco to the conversation. Cuckoo Coco conversation. It's not cuckoo though. It's evil. It's satanic. Yeah. It's intentional. Like so many of the things that, one of the thoughts that crossed my mind from just my general Twitter watching was that they put Biden in there to act. Well, he acts like a buffoon. He does all kinds of goofy things in order to convince us that the disasters that are happening to our country are accidental, that they're not planned. And I think that there's so many now going on, these concurrent disasters, whether it's blowing up food plants or train derailments or everything else, shows that our government is not responsible to we the people anymore. And that's where I think the liberals are going to have to wake up, because you can't, just like Diane and I were talking last night, you're either you're either against war or you're not against war. And all the people that thought they were against war during the 60s and the 70s, when I was a protester and so many others of my good friends were out there, are sitting it out. They're just watching it on television and, hoping that their faith in Biden is not misplaced. But I think it's terrible.
They're submitting to the power of this war hawk neocon faction. And there's an arrogance when you talk about the satanic nature of these policies. There's an arrogance that they think that because people aren't out in the streets, that people are supporting them and that they're doing a good enough job to keep people quiet. I mean, imagine the comment of the Transportation Secretary Buttigieg when he was initially asked about the derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. And he said, well, we have one of these a week. Now, here's the transportation secretary sort of blithely dismissing the fact that trains run off the tracks once a week, with some of which trains are carrying lethal chemicals and nitrogen and other explosives. That just shows the tone. Someone said tone deafness. No, I think it's arrogant disregard for the interests of the people that they supposedly represent. And the same thing is true if you look at Syria. The update I did this morning on my daily update was, we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War. Have we gotten an apology yet from the Bush administration for lying to get us into that war, in which over 1 million Iraqis died, almost 5,000 US servicemen? Al-Qaeda was launched from that. Have we gotten an apology for the lying to us? No, of course not. How about the British side of it? Because it was the British who concocted the dossier that was used by Colin Powell when he made a total ass of himself in front of the United Nations on weapons of mass destruction and Saddam's connection to Al-Qaeda, both of which turned out to be completely false. John, since you've been gone, there's a couple of other things. I don't remember if we had a chance to talk about the Hirsch story before the last time I was on.
Let's talk about it.
The other thing that came out is Jeff Girth, a former New York Times investigative reporter, wrote a 24,000-word article that was published by the Columbia Journalism Review, which is the premier journalistic publication in the country, a commentary on the state of journalism. And it was called The Press versus the President. And it's about the consistent pattern of lying that went back and forth between the media, the intelligence community, and the Congress on Russiagate. For people who haven't seen it, it's worth going to the Columbia Journalism Review. Jeff Girth, it's highly detailed. It's many things that you and I have discussed over a long time, but it's another example of not just lying, but the fact that they're not yet willing to acknowledge these lies. They still say that Russia hacked the DNC and Hillary Clinton computers. They still say that despite lack of evidence. Now they're saying China is going to send weapons to Russia with a lack of evidence to prove that Russia is committing massive war crimes in Ukraine. And who are they using for witnesses on that? The Ukrainian government counter ops teams. It's just, I had a debate with a Ukrainian American Congress official the other day on a radio station or a television station in Iran. And when I brought up the fact that Merkel and Hollande lied about the Minsk Accord to buy time for Ukraine to build up to go to war with Russia, he said, that's a conspiracy theory. So I said, well, they actually said it. And he said, no, their words were twisted by conspiracy theorists like you. So there are people who are committed to maintaining a narrative that's evil. And I think the good news is, since we last talked, we had this demonstration in Berlin a week ago Saturday. 50,000 people showed up. This was astounding. I couldn't go because I was warned that the Ukrainians might be there, and I'm on their list and they have my picture. But friends of mine and some family members went. They were shocked by the fact that it was a crowd that was optimistic. And they were calling out the foreign minister Baerbock, who said, we're now at war with Russia, and also Schultz, the chancellor. Why won't Schultz answer the question of, did Biden tell him that the U.S. was going to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline? Now, I don't know if you saw this, John, but today the New York Times said they're now beginning to get a picture that it was a Ukrainian group that carried out the action. No details. No one knows who funded it, where they got the explosives, and so on. But this counters the Hirsch story. So instead of addressing what Seymour Hersh did in a detailed report that Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, and Victoria Nuland and the CIA Director Burns coordinated the sabotage of the North Sea pipeline to force Germany to stay in the war, instead of investigating that, they're coming up with the counter story, which is that Hirsch is old. He's just using one source. There's no confirmation, and the U.S. is denying it. So that's how the narrative is sustained, and we really need to have people talking out to expose it.
Well, when they go to the conspiracy theory, that's one of their last lines of defense.
Yeah.
It indicates that you've pierced pretty deeply into their defenses, and they're now throwing, just the most banal idea at you, the one that's existed for 100 years, and it's very effective for people that aren't willing to do the homework and dig behind the scenes and figure out what's really at issue in the conversation.
There's you talk about doing the homework. There's a book behind me called the something about Ukraine. It's over this shoulder. But it's by Professor Sakwa, who's a very prominent historian. And he goes through the buildup from before 2014 that made Ukraine the center of a strategy to dismember Russia. And now we're getting documentation from just last fall. The Jamestown Foundation and the Heritage Institute had a conference where speaker after speaker said, minimally, we have to continue this war until Russia can be broken apart and subject to dismantling. And what's the idea behind that? Grab their raw materials. And who are funding these kinds of think tanks? Well, BlackRock, for example. And BlackRock has a lot to gain from dismantling sovereign states so they can go in and grab up their territory, just as they're doing in Ukraine, buying the richest farmland when Zelensky's privatizing it. So, these are not narratives or conspiracy theory. These are provable truths. Whereas the conspiracy theory is that Vladimir Putin is whispering in my ear or paying me or giving the Schiller Institute lines to attack Biden and the West. Now, it's provable that that's a conspiracy theory, the idea that I'm paid by Russia. You can check my finances. There's absolutely no way that first of all, I would accept any money, but that's not what Putin is doing. So, they accuse you of what they do. They're the ones with the conspiracy theories.
A friend of mine used to say, they'll beat you over the head with your own principles. And yeah, that's what they do. And whatever they are doing, they'll accuse you of it, so that if they ever get caught doing it, they can say, well, we just did it because they did it. The overriding issue of dismantling Russia seems to be the real goal of these people that are pushing the wars all around the world. The liberals don't seem to focus on that being the goal. They just want, liberals basically are live and let live people, but for some reason they can't let Russia just live and let live. They've been weaponized. The minds of our liberal friends have been weaponized against Russia. How effective the propaganda of the last 100 years has been is obvious, because again, the peaceniks of yesterday are all pro-war today. You have to congratulate Bernays and Lippmann and Freud and all the from Haley and all the manipulators, right down to Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert today, that are very, very good at forming a false but very palatable alternative reality. And it's based upon that whole idea of, well, if you don't agree with me, then you're a conspiracy theorist. And so the mocking comes out, and just mocking. That was it, mock castles down, as Shakespeare says in Henry V.
The people you just mentioned, Stewart and Colbert, they're very well compensated for what they do.
Oh yeah,
they're extremely wealthy. They have big fat paychecks coming in, and they actually, when they were in a kind of opposition position years ago, they were actually pretty funny and clever. But now you see they're using their capabilities to undermine the fight for truth. And this is then reinforced by the censorship regime. You know, what we're learning about Twitter from Matt Taibbi, that it wasn't so much that Twitter, the corporation, was the source of the censorship. They were doing censorship, but they were doing it at the urging of powerful people in the Congress like Adam Schiff, and then with deployment of intelligence agencies inside them to tell them who to cut off and who to cover. So, you know, we keep coming back to the same thing. Who's got power in this country? It's not the people. And, you know, I think one of the things about the old 60s liberals is that between smoking too much pot and making too much money and recreation, they've given up the spirit they once had of wanting to fight for truth and justice. You know, the civil rights movement was moved by the eloquent appeals of Martin Luther King, the sacrifice made by people like Rosa Parks and Amelia Boynton Robinson, people who were beaten by racist police, people who lost their lives like Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. Now, these were people who provided a moral compass that eventually the whole country moved behind. Today, people are splintered into such small identity groups that it's hard to pull them together. But we did see with the demonstration in Washington on, I think it was February 19th, the fact that you had the Libertarian Party and the People's Party coming together represented a shift. And what they said is, look, we can fight later on over the question of what is legitimate money, whether the Fed should be dismantled. But we now agree that we've got to mobilize to make sure there's not a nuclear war, either by accident or by design. And what did the media say? They lied about how small it is. They said it's neo-Nazis joining up with leftists. You know, when in fact, and the same thing in Germany. In Germany, they tried to undermine the leader of the peace movement in Germany, who's a woman named Sarah Wagenknecht. I think people will be hearing a lot more from her. She was a leader of the Linkspartei, the left party, but her own party abandoned her because they said she's making an alliance with the right wing. And she said, look, I'm not going to work with the official right party, the Alternative for Deutschland, but anyone in that group or anyone who wants peace is welcome at our rally. And I think this is the beginning of a reawakening of the peace movement in Germany. And this is at great peril for the Schultz government, because the Schultz government is run by the war hawks of the Green Party. And Schultz himself is losing support in his own party.
Just to say war hawks of the Green Party, I mean, that ought to wake people up. Say, what? I mean, you got to do a double take when you say war hawks of the Green Party. Yeah, well, I thought the Greens were, you know, peaceniks, and, you know, what do you mean?
We love nature. We want everyone to have clean air, and yeah. Well,
Yeah.
no, go back to the Joschka Fischer and the Balkans War. You know, we were essentially sold a bill of goods that the Slobodan Milosevic and the people of Serbia were committing mass genocide against Kosovo and Bosnia. And, you know, it was a pretty rough situation there for a while, but they never found mass graves or huge numbers of people killed. But a narrative was created by people like Samantha Power, who's now the head of the U.S. Agency for International Development. Her husband, Chicago law professor Cass Sunstein, was one of the people who educated Barack Obama and brought him in to the inner circle. Samantha Power is one of the key people pushing this idea of the responsibility to protect. And so what did they say? They said the poor people in Bosnia and Kosovo are being oppressed, and we have to support and defend them. And I don't know if you remember the movie Wag the Dog, or
Yeah.
Wag the tail wags the dog, or something like that.
It's like 20 years ago. I remember it vaguely, but the
But
whole,
it showed how they used fake scenes of war to get people to support an intervention. That's what Bill Clinton did. The United States bombed Serbia for 90 something straight days, NATO also. And, this is when they say there's not been a war in Europe since World War II, they're lying. When they're saying there's been no change of borders or boundaries since World War II, they're lying. And then they agreed to have a referendum in Kosovo. They voted to separate from Serbia, and they did. So why can't the people of the Donbass have a referendum and separate from Ukraine, especially since the Ukrainians have been killing them? So, you see the hypocrisy over and over and over. And, John, I'm like you on this. I look back at my friends from the 60s and 70s from the peace movement and wonder how they got so complacent about injustice, how they could tolerate what's being done to children in Syria or the families in Afghanistan or the children in Yemen or to Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is being obliterated, not by Russia, but by NATO's decision to keep the war going. And there was a very powerful intervention this last week from China, a 12-point peace plan, which starts, what their number one point in the peace plan is? Respect for sovereignty of all parties. Second point, end to the Cold War mentality. Third point, end the fighting. Fourth point, negotiate. Now, Zelensky said, well, this sounds like something we can talk about, although he refuses to negotiate. But Biden and Blinken and the head of NATO, Stoltenberg, all rejected it out of hand, saying China has no role to play in this. So it's clear that the NATO side wants to fight this war to the last Ukrainian. So, and the people of Ukraine are the ones who are suffering. So, we've got a moment of reckoning that we have to force as a citizenry. And if we were to end this war and take up the question of not just reconstruction of Ukraine, but reconstruction of Syria, of Iraq, of Afghanistan, of building up the physical economies of the poorer African nations, we'd have more than enough to do. We wouldn't have to spend hundreds of billions on war fighting. We could spend it on building power plants and roads and high-speed rail and water purification and hospitals. That's what we should do. And we should do it in our own country as we see trains derailing every week. So where is the thinking? Where are these people's heads?
I think it's all about Orange Man. I think, somebody held a Orange Man doll in front of their face every morning and says, whatever you do, don't let Orange Man get into the presidency. And then, whatever they have to do to avoid Orange Man, they just do it, whether it's agreeing with Blinken or whatever. Unfortunately, you still
John, one of the two people who voted against the extension of sanctions in the U.S. Congress was Marjorie Taylor Greene, one of the two congressmen who refused to kill Syrian kids. And the other one was Tom Massey of Kentucky.
Tom Massey's been getting a little bit of play. I've seen him. I don't know much about Marjorie Taylor Greene except for they don't like her much on the other
Well,
side.
she made some
Tell us about
she
her.
made some fairly crazy comments, like the forest fires in California are caused by Jewish lasers funded by Soros in space.
Oh,
So she made some of these.
Disagree. I don't think they're Jewish.
But she's actually on the question of the Ukraine war. She's one of the more sensible people in the Congress.
Okay. A question for you about Pope Francis and the Catholic Church, and the Schiller Institute has made great efforts to support the idea of Pope Francis convening a negotiation, offering the good offices of the Holy See to provide a negotiating space to end the war. And, I was at the February 19th rally on the Mall with a number of your colleagues, one of whom was Stuart
Mhm.
Battle, I think his last name.
Yeah.
And he asked me, what did I think about, the effort to get the Pope's, to support the Pope's initiative. And I kind of, from a visceral response, said, well, there's what, 1 billion Catholics out there in the world, at least nominally. And if the Pope were to say to those billion people, hey, we got to stop this war right now. Um, all you Catholics out there, I want you to call your congressman, your president, your dictator, whoever it is, and say, in this war, just stop it. And I don't see a moral leadership in Pope Francis. I think he's kind of abdicated and sitting back and letting, the worldly forces control the outcome. Whereas I think we need some spiritual guidance here. Am I being too critical, or? But that's my gut feeling is that if the Pope really wants to work for peace, say something.
Well, I'm like you. I have a certain mixed sentiment around this. I think he could do much, much more by really mobilizing the Catholic Church. But I also remember the famous statement by Stalin when he was told that something about World War II and the Vatican would oppose some of what he's doing. And he said, well, how many divisions does the Pope have? The Vatican is so committed to holding the church together that I think they're afraid to engage directly in what would be seen as a political intervention. Now, in spite of that, the Pope still has a certain amount of moral authority, but he should be more aggressive. He should be out there in St. Peter's Square with a bullhorn, directing the world's Catholics to act for peace. Uh, there are some people who are doing that. Lula, the new president of Brazil, has said he would support a group of nations that would push for peace. Uh, Modi, the prime minister of India, just had a very interesting intervention at the G20 foreign ministers meeting in Delhi, where the G7 countries, that is the Western countries, made a big push to get a resolution against Russia and Ukraine. And the rest of the countries, including Mexico, India, Brazil, the global South countries, plus Russia and China, refused to go along with that, and they issued no communique on that. And what Modi said is what we're interested in is what unites us, namely a commitment to development, to ending poverty, and not to fighting wars. This is a big slap in the face to the US, which has been courting India like crazy with the Quad policy. And India also rejected the Quad call. That's Japan, Australia, US, and India. They rejected the call for the Quad to condemn Russia. So, there are leaders who are stepping forward. Not a single US congressman, except Marjorie Taylor Greene. But we did see, if you were at the rally, you had Dennis Kucinich, a former presidential candidate, Jill Stein, the Green Party presidential candidate, two other former presidential candidates. Who were they? Tulsi Gabbard and Ron Paul. So you had 4 former presidential candidates speaking at the rally from Democratic Party, Republican Party, Libertarian, and Green. So the potential is there, but the US Congress is so tightly controlled by lobbyists that they won't do it. And I think, to go back to your question about the Pope, I think the fear that at least the people in the Catholic Church hierarchy have is that if they get too political, they're going to get burned. And that's the kind of hesitancy which, as you say, diminishes their moral authority. They should be willing to stand for truth and fight for truth, even if it means they have to go against the powers in the earth. That's what I take as the message of Jesus Christ. You do what's right.
Yeah, no matter what. What on Pope Francis, You may recall, I certainly recall because I made a big point of it at the time, that the first year of his papacy, he was a real peacemaker. He was a go out and find the poor people and serve the poor people, wash the feet famously of the poor. And, who am I to judge with regard to gay people? And I thought, well, this is a breath of fresh air, a pope that's going to speak honestly and truthfully about things like peace and war and humanity. It was maybe a year into his papacy that his nephew and his nephew's family was wiped out in a horrific automobile collision involving a big truck and no brakes. And the scenario, it just resonated in my mind at the time that this is what they do. This is a Gary Webb. This is a brushback pitch in baseball terms. If you don't, you've got to start towing the line here, Pope, and we're going to enforce our rules with you by taking out your family members. I think that may have happened in my own family, and I do think that people are foolish not to consider that this may have happened to Pope Francis. In that he suddenly shut up and started towing the line, and I think he's kind of intimidated to this point. Also, there's the associations with Gladio and P2 and the whole Kissinger, horrible policies to control the Pope. But also, we have the historic enmity between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church of Russia, which Putin has kind of championed the Orthodox Church of Russia. And I'm afraid that that may also be one of the reasons that Pope Francis, being a Roman Catholic, cannot say, that we should make peace, because of the extended history between the Italian powers, the black nobility, the old money of Italy, and their desire to control Russia, which goes back, as people in the chat room have pointed out, to Napoleon and before that, where you have these Western Europeans that think that they can control Russia.
Right.
Once again, it's the same story. Nevertheless, we're doubling down and doubling down and doubling down again with more billions of dollars to Zelensky, who, by the way, I've got him swimming around in a frogman suit down under the North Sea, putting bombs on the North Sea pipeline, thanks to your imagery. But that's the story. Old powers still exert the hidden hand over people and keep them from doing what I think, any pope really should do, is to stand up and say, stop this war right now, and then let's sit down and talk.
Well, John, one of the things my associates are doing is we're approaching parish priests. We're approaching local and regional officials in the church, working through Pax Christi. And there's a good collaboration between what we're doing and the Pax Christi International Organization. And so on the grassroots level, we need a more intensive mobilization, which could then move up toward the top. But I think the church has a certain kind of static approach to these things, and it's I would not underestimate the importance of the Pope offering the Vatican as a venue for talks with no preconditions. And the Russians have said they would be willing to do that. So it's not Russian Orthodox versus Catholicism. Zelensky, who shut down the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and the old Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which was tied to Moscow, he's the one who's rejected the Pope's offer. So I think this is it's a complicated question, but the idea that you can rely on an institution which is pulled in many directions. Remember, you have the Jesuits, you have as you mentioned, the old Italian families. Look at the current government in Italy. The Meloni came in with the expectation that she would be at least standing up against the European Union and against NATO. She's going straight with NATO and the EU. And when Berlusconi, who's in her coalition, talked against that, her people put out a warning to him that he could be kicked out of the government. So there's a lot of pressure on these governments. I think the most interesting thing is going to be to see what happens in the next 3 to 4 weeks with the German government. Our good friend Ray McGovern was with me on the Manhattan Project discussion last Saturday, and he took up this question of what happened when Schultz came to visit Biden last week. Now, it's somewhat unusual in the midst of this incredible moment of chaos for someone to come across the ocean for a 1-hour meeting with Biden and issue no communique, no joint press conference at the end. The only thing they said before it started, Biden thanked Schultz for making changes in Germany to provide weapons, and Schultz said, well, we're united in this. Now, what Ray McGovern suggested is that maybe Schultz wanted the meeting with Biden because he was afraid Biden might say something about that Schultz was aware of the U.S. Commitment to destroy the Nord Stream pipelines. And so, like an old mafia thing, he came there and said, Joe, buddy, you can't sell me out. They're coming after me in Germany. You can't tell them that I had any knowledge of this. So I don't know if it's true or not, but if people want to see it, it's at the Schiller Institute website, the or the LaRouche organization website, the Manhattan Project show from Saturday. Ray was quite ironic in the way he presented it. But I think it does raise an interesting question. The head of Bavaria, Söder, the Bavarian party, government party, is the Christian Social Union, which is a partner with the Christian Democrats. So it's the second largest party in Germany. But Söder issued a statement the other day saying Baerbock, the foreign minister, should shut her mouth before she gets us all killed. And this kind of language is very unusual in these diplomatic circles. Similarly, the Chinese foreign minister came out and said the U.S. is about to cross a red line in Taiwan. And how can the U.S. tell us that we should not provide weapons to Russia, which we're not doing, but the U.S. is providing weapons to Taiwan? The U.S. doesn't care about sovereignty. So the language between the Chinese and the U.S. has gone up a notch. And the Chinese generally have been fairly low key, including, the shooting down of the weather balloon. In China, they make fun of that. One other thing, I think you'll get a kick out of this. The latest package of sanctions against Russia includes sanctions against sending hair dryers, toasters, washing machines, because they have component parts that the State Department and Defense Department say could be used for Russian weapons. So the Russian cartoonists are doing cartoons of Russian soldiers crossing into Ukraine carrying hair dryers and toasters.
Well, it's sad. It's pitiful, really. I don't see us going into a world war situation. I don't see it. And this is the frustrating thing, and I'll just leave this with you as my last contribution to our talk this morning, is that when you think about Bertrand Russell and the Pugwash conferences and the mutually assured destruction idea, is that not the mechanism that allows these smaller wars to continue? If we did not have this idea of, nuclear war is the end of all civilization, and therefore we have to avoid it at all costs, even if the cost is that we do all these little border wars, or even what is a real war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
That front line is 500-600 miles long, and hundreds of guys are getting killed every day. It's like World War I in Ukraine right now, with all the, it's horrible.
John, I think you're right about mutual and assured destruction. which is why Lyndon LaRouche made the proposal for developing the special weapons with new physical principles that could be used to knock out missiles in flight. The idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative, that you can't trust, if you have a confrontation between different countries, how could you trust them to stick to an agreement that you get rid of 500 missiles, we'll get rid of 500 missiles? That kind of arms control doesn't work. But if you have the technology to take down incoming missiles, then perhaps you take away the incentive to build those weapons and to deploy them. And otherwise, you're in a constant danger that you might accidentally cross a tripwire. And I did an update yesterday where I said, look, don't dismiss the possibility of nuclear war just because it's so crazy. Because LaRouche always said that you have to consider the factor of lunacy when you're talking about people in the establishment, the oligarchs. But the Russians are extremely careful. So are the Chinese. And so are some of the people in the US military. Not in the Defense Department establishment, the permanent bureaucracy. That's where you see lunacy, where they're gaming how to win a limited nuclear war. So we have to move to what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has been emphasizing, a new strategic architecture based on a new economic development architecture where the interests of every nation, every sovereign nation are taken into consideration, both from a strategic and economic standpoint. If we can't do that, we're trapped in this world where we're one accident away from annihilating the human race.
All right, guys, let's take this seriously. One accident away from annihilating the human race is a serious message to close our show with today, Harley. And Harley Schlanger, it's always a pleasure and a privilege to have you join me and share your thoughts with me and indulge me with sharing a few of mine with you. It's terrific, and I sure do appreciate it, and I look forward to the next time.
I'll see you again in 2 weeks, John.
All right, Harley Schlanger, everybody. Thanks again, and we'll see you tomorrow.